This is Chapter 5 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 5, Tom Sawyer and His Band. In beginning The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, the author says, "Most of the adventures recorded in this book really occurred." And he tells us that Huck Finn is drawn from life, Tom Sawyer also, though not from a single individual, being a composite of three boys whom Mark Twain had known. The three boys were himself, almost entirely, with traces of two schoolmates, John Briggs and Will Bowen. John Briggs was also the original of Joe Harper, the terror of the seas. As for Huck Finn, the red-handed, his original was a village waif named Tom Blankenship, who needed no change for his part in the story. The Blankenship family picked up an uncertain livelihood, fishing and hunting, and lived at first under a tree in a bark shanty, but later moved into a large barn-like building back of the Clemens home on Hill Street. There were three male members of the household: old Ben, the father, shiftless and dissolute; young Ben, the eldest son, a doubtful character with certain good traits; and Tom, that is to say, Huck, who was just as he is described in the book, a ruin of rags, a river rat, kind of heart, and accountable for his conduct to nobody in the world. He could come and go as he chose. He never had to work or go to school. He could do all the things, good and bad, that other boys longed to do and were forbidden. To them he was the symbol of liberty. His knowledge of fishing, trapping, signs, and of the woods and river gave value to his society, while the fact that it was forbidden made it necessary to Sam Clemens's happiness. The Blankenships being handy to the back gate of the Hill Street house, he adopted them at sight. Their free mode of life suited him. He was likely to be there at any hour of the day, and Tom made cat-call signals at night that would bring Sam out on the shed roof at the back and down a little trellis and flight of steps to the group of boon companions which, besides Tom, usually included John Briggs, Will Pitts, and the two younger Bowen boys. They were not malicious boys, but just mischievous, fun-loving boys, little boys of 10 or 12, rather thoughtless, being mainly bent on having a good time. They had a wide field of action. They ranged from Holliday's Hill on the north to the Cave on the south, and over the fields and through all the woods between. They explored both banks of the river, the islands, and the deep wilderness of the Illinois shore. They could run like turkeys and swim like ducks. They could handle a boat as if born in one. No orchard or melon patch was entirely safe from them. No dog or slave patrol was so watchful that they did not sooner or later elude it. They borrowed boats with or without the owner's consent. It did not matter. Most of their expeditions were harmless enough. They often cruised up to Turtle Island, about 2 miles above Hannibal, and spent the day feasting. There were quantities of turtles and their eggs there, and mussels, and plenty of fish. Fishing and swimming were their chief pastimes, with incidental raiding for adventure. Bear Creek was their swimming place by day, and the river front at nightfall, a favorite spot being where the railroad bridge now ends. It was a good distance across to the island where, in the book, Tom Sawyer musters his pirate band, and where later Huck found Nigger Jim, but quite often in the evening they swam across to it, and when they had frolicked for an hour or more on the sandbar at the head of the island, they would swim back in the dusk, breasting the strong, steady Mississippi current without exhaustion or dread. They could swim all day, those little scamps, and seemed to have no fear. Once, during his boyhood, Sam Clemens swam across to the Illinois side, then turned and swam back again without landing, a distance of at least 2 miles as he had to go. He was seized with a cramp on the return trip. His legs became useless, and he was obliged to make the remaining distance with his arms. The adventures of Sam Clemens and his comrades would fill several books of the size of Tom Sawyer. Many of them are, of course, forgotten now, but those still remembered show that Mark Twain had plenty of real material. It was not easy to get money in those days, and the boys were often without it. Once Huck Blankenship had the skin of a coon he had captured, and offered to sell it to raise capital. At Selm's store on Wildcat Corner the coon skin would bring 10 cents, but this was not enough. The boys thought of a plan to make it bring more. Selm's back window was open, and the place where he kept his pelts was pretty handy. Huck went around to the front door and sold the skin for 10 cents to Selms, who tossed it back on the pile. Then Huck came back, and after waiting a reasonable time, crawled in the open window, got the coonskin, and sold it to Selms again. He did this several times that afternoon, and the capital of the band grew. But at last John Pierce, Selm's clerk, said, "Look here, Mr. Selms, there's something wrong about this. That boy has been selling us coonskins all afternoon." Selms went back to his pile of pelts. There were several sheepskins and some cowhides, but only one coonskin, the one he had that moment bought. Selms himself, in after years, used to tell this story as a great joke. One of the boys' occasional pastimes was to climb Holliday's Hill and roll down big stones to frighten the people who were driving by. Holliday's Hill above the road was steep. A stone, once started, would go plunging downward and bound across the road with the deadly momentum of a shell. The boys would get a stone poised, then wait until they saw a team approaching, and calculating the distance would give the boulder a start. Dropping behind the bushes, they would watch the sudden effect upon the party below as the great missile shot across the road a few yards before them. This was huge sport, but they carried it too far, for at last they planned a grand climax that would surpass anything before attempted in the stone rolling line. A monstrous boulder was lying up there in the right position to go downhill once started. It would be a glorious thing to see that great stone go smashing down 100 yards or so in front of some peaceful-minded countryman jogging along the road. Quarrymen had been getting out rock not far away and had left their picks and shovels handy. The boys borrowed the tools and went to work to undermine the big stone. They worked at it several hours. If their parents had asked them to work like that, they would have thought they were being killed. Finally, while they were still digging, the big stone suddenly got loose and started down. They were not ready for it at all. Nobody was coming but an old colored man in a cart. Their splendid stone was going to be wasted. One could hardly call it wasted, however. They had planned for a thrilling result, and there was certainly thrill enough while it lasted. In the first place, the stone nearly caught Will Bowen when it started. John Briggs had that moment quit digging and handed Will the pick. Will was about to take his turn when Sam Clemens leapt aside with a yell, "Look out, boys, she's coming!" She came. The huge boulder kept to the ground at first, then, gathering momentum, it went bounding into the air. About halfway down the hill it struck a sapling and cut it clean off. This turned its course a little, and the negro in the cart, hearing the noise and seeing the great mass come crashing in his direction, made a wild effort to whip up his mule. The boys watched their bomb with growing interest. It was headed straight for the negro, also for a cooper shop across the road. It made longer leaps with every bound, and wherever it struck, fragments and dust would fly. The shop happened to be empty, but the rest of the catastrophe would call for close investigation. They wanted to fly, but they could not move until they saw the rock land. It was making mighty leaps now, and the terrified negro had managed to get exactly in its path. The boys stood holding their breath, their mouths open. Then suddenly they could hardly believe their eyes. A little way above the road the boulder struck a projection, made one mighty leap into the air, sailed clear over the negro and his mule, and landed in the soft dirt beyond the road, only a fragment striking the shop, damaging but not wrecking it. Half buried in the ground, the great stone lay there for nearly 40 years. Then it was broken up. It was the last rock the boys ever rolled down. Nearly 60 years later, John Briggs and Mark Twain walked across Holliday's Hill and looked down toward the river road. Mark Twain said, "It was a mighty good thing, John, that stone acted the way it did. We might have had to pay a fancy price for that old darky. I can see him yet." Footnote 1. John Briggs died in 1907. Earlier in the same year, the writer of this memoir spent an afternoon with him and obtained from him most of the material for this chapter. It can be no harm now to confess that the boy Sam Clemens, a pretty small boy, a good deal less than 12 at the time, and by no